I feel like the last few years have brought us to a bit of an inflection point for open-world video games, which I personally feel have been in kind of a rut for the better part of the last decade, if not longer. Open-world games can trace their origins back to pioneering games like Ultima, The Legend of Zelda, and Sid Meier's Pirates, and are defined by their emphasis on free-roaming exploratory gameplay and nonlinear progression. The genre, if you want to call it a genre, evolved gradually through the 80s and 90s with games like Mercenary, Wasteland, The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfell, and King's Quest VI. But these titles were mostly niche games. Most players' exposure to the open-world concept was through the various Legend of Zelda sequels. In 2001, however, the open-world floodgates burst open with the mainstream success of the genre-defining, or redefining I guess, Grand Theft Auto 3. This game set many of the standards for future open-world games. It was structured as a player-driven sandbox that encouraged players to make their own fun within the game's numerous procedural systems. But it also featured a highly linear, cinematic story, which the players could progress at their own pace. Artsy and experimental games such as Shadow of the Colossus, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and Dark Souls, which I do consider to be an open-world game in all of the ways that matter, would continue to be released, and they would inflate the critical and consumer impressions of the open-world paradigm and the freedom that it offers. Around this time, however, Ubisoft started releasing its Assassin's Creed and Far Cry games, which would standardize open-world designs and inspire numerous derivative copycats. It took the basic design of Grand Theft Auto 3 with its rigidly linear missions broken up by collectible hunts and time-wasting filler content. This is when I started becoming thoroughly disillusioned with open worlds as a concept. Longtime readers of my personal blog will probably be very familiar with the complaints that I'm about to levy. The two core complaints that I had with this particular paradigm of open-world game design are, 1. That the map itself rarely feels meaningful as a game space, and it instead serves primarily as a convoluted mission select screen full of time-wasting filler content. And 2. That the sandboxy nature of the game design means that the world and narrative often feel stagnant, as if it's stuck in a kind of limbo. Aside from Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed and Far Cry series, these problems have been present to varying degrees in everything from Skyrim to the Saboteur to Mad Max, Just Cause, The Amazing Spider-Man, Fallout 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, and many, many, many more. It started getting to the point that when I would see a game advertise the size of its map, I'd just kind of roll my eyes and say, great, that's just more wasting my time walking from place to place with nothing meaningful or interesting or challenging to do. Where you are on the map, where you're going, and how you get there was almost completely irrelevant in these games. In fact, some games have even started introducing mechanics that let you bypass the map entirely by letting you fly, glide, or zipline to points of interest without having to engage with the space in between at all, which made the map itself, no matter how big and scenic it might happen to be, feel mostly irrelevant. Metal Gear Solid 5's Afghanistan map kind of went in another direction, in which the roads are lined with sheer cliffs which funnel the player along linear paths from enemy outpost to enemy outpost, with practically nothing for you to do in the spaces between outposts. Even though the stealth action at those outposts in MGS5 were some of the best in the series, I still couldn't help but think that Snake Eater provided a much more fulfilling experience of living within an open-ended game world. The maps themselves weren't really play spaces anymore. They were just the spaces in between towns, dungeons, and other set pieces where the actual gameplay would take place. Just point in the direction of a waypoint and walk in a straight line, stopping every minute or so to pick up an umpteenth collectible, or climb an umpteenth tower, or sneak into an umpteenth enemy base and kill the umpteenth recycled mini-boss. Stop me if you've done all this before. A majority of the time with the game was just traveling around the map without any engagement in any gameplay systems or mechanics or strategies, and then stopping to play some rote recycled filler content to pass the time. And as the maps got bigger and bigger, the filler content just kept multiplying and getting more redundant and tedious. But then, a few years ago, this started to change. Games started implementing actual mechanics for navigating the maps, turning those repetitive mission select screens back into valid play spaces. I first noticed this transition happening with Assassin's Creed Black Flag, while seamlessly sailing around the Caribbean in search of trade routes to plunder. But sailing and steering the pirate ship was, in fact, a simple matter of pointing in a direction and going, the same old problem that had been plaguing the series for years. Even though all the gameplay had been moved out of towns and dungeons and back onto the map of the open sea, the act of navigating that sea was still pretty trivial. I had a similar reaction to games like Shadow of Mordor, which again moved a lot of its gameplay back out onto the actual open world map as opposed to being confined to dungeons and other small set pieces, but actually getting around that map was still not a mechanically engaging or interesting process.
Look, there's been a murder!
I first started noticing mechanical and systemic navigation of maps in late 2016 and early 2017 when games like Final Fantasy XV and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released. Final Fantasy XV has all the trademarks of contemporary open-world games. It's got its linear, cinematic main story missions separated by a large map full of collectible hunts and fetch quests. But the difference here is that you weren't really free to just walk around in straight lines towards the next mission. Your movement using the car in Final Fantasy XV is constrained to follow the game's highways, and nighttime travel is restricted by severely overleveled monsters that force you to stop at a motel or at a campground to sleep off the night, level up your characters, and wait until the safety of the morning. Or just, take care of any lingering quests that you have left to do in towns.
One hell of a crowd.
This must be the main thoroughfare.
She's at the Laville. Let's go.
In addition to not being able to travel at night, you have to fill the car up with gasoline periodically. You can't burn all of your gil on Potion, Phoenix Downs, and the best weapons available every time you stop in a shop like you could do in previous Final Fantasy games, since you now have to save at least some of that money for living expenses like fuel, food, and lodging. Living expenses, by the way, are something that video games rarely, ever make you have to worry about. And that actually provides considerable incentive to keep taking on all the side quests that litter the game, since you actually need the money. And even the fast travel mechanic is not instantaneous and separated by a load screen. It's handled by actually watching an NPC drive the car to your destination in real time. Unless you pay a small fee of gil, and then you're allowed to just skip the travel time with a load screen. Where you are on the map in Final Fantasy XV, where you are going, and how you choose to get there, as well as how long it actually takes to get to the destination, were suddenly very important factors to gameplay and strategy. Every expedition out into the world requires some careful forethought, planning, and route optimization, so that you don't end up out of gas and stranded when the sun goes down and nigh invincible iron golems start literally crawling up out of the ground. Unfortunately, I feel like Final Fantasy XV kinda waffles on these concepts. Fast travel doesn't consume fuel for the car for some reason, which completely negates the entire logistical element of the game once you've explored enough of the map to have fast travel destinations for almost everywhere you care to go. There also aren't enough campsites, and you can't just make camp anywhere, which means that the game always gives you the opportunity to fast travel back to town when night falls, which again, completely negates the mechanic. It also lacks a lot of UI conveniences that would help you plan out your travels. The travel menu tells you how long, in real time, it will take you to reach a destination, but it gives no indication as to what time of day you'll arrive, how long the given quest might take, or how much fuel the trip will consume. So you have little more to go on besides an educated guess as to whether you can make the trip and return to a camp or a hotel by nightfall, or whether you will run out of gas on the way. The game also pauses when you go to the character menu, meaning that you can't convert the driving time into constructive time by gearing up for a quest, using Elemency to craft spells, or so on, while the car is moving. And once you get to a destination, there's no wait option in the map or menu in the event that a particular quest can only be triggered at a certain time of day. These failings of the game reduce the logistical planning elements from being a core gameplay mechanic down to little more than minor inconveniences, which is probably a big reason that this game received such a mixed reception when it was released. Good ideas, not very good implementation. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, does not have a car with a constantly draining gas tank, nor are you stuck to traveling along highways. Instead, Breath of the Wild uses a stamina gauge and natural obstacles to force the player to have to think carefully about where they go and how they get there. These games aren't so much about going anywhere you please. They're about figuring out how to get there. Like with Final Fantasy XV, monsters come out at night in an attempt to limit Link's nighttime exploration. It's not nearly as effective as Final Fantasy XV, since the little skeletons that crawl out of the ground are mostly pushovers. I mean, it's not like Lynels are coming out to rampage in the pale moonlight. More importantly, though, Breath of the Wild lives up to its name and is refreshingly open-ended. The objective to defeat the final boss is given to you at the very start of the game, and you could, if you wanted to, walk up to the final boss and try to accomplish it. Good luck doing it, though. The bulk of the main story questline is to handle any one of 4 minor objectives in any order that you want. Other than that, the whole game is basically just exploring the map to find the shrines and to power up your character so that you can eventually confront Calamity Ganon. Heck, this game even requires the player to manually place your own waypoints and map markers for many map features, which just further reinforces the idea that you are exploring this map on your own terms and at your own pace. The landmarks or collectibles or pickups in the game that are important to you are the ones that you mark on the map, and the ones that aren't important, you don't have to bother marking on the map. And as I said, you play the game at your own pace. After all, Ganon basically already won 1,000 years ago, and he's been sitting around in his victorious complacency while the Kingdom of Hyrule has been begrudgingly maintaining a defeated status quo ever since. So the sandbox structure of the game's narrative is not undercut by some impending doom that artificially inflates the stakes and pretends to make the main quest more urgent than it actually is, which is a problem in a lot of other large open-world RPGs like Skyrim and also, to a certain extent, The Witcher 3. But if it is a player-driven sandbox narrative that you're looking for, the new gold standard might very well be Red Dead Redemption 2. Players play this game as an outlaw living amongst a band of other outlaws. You and your gang are just trying to live day by day, making money where they can and always hoping for that next big score that always seems to be just over the horizon. There's no missing loved one that needs rescuing ASAP, no impending dragon apocalypse, no villain mastermind supposedly planning your downfall. Arthur isn't the chosen one archetype, single-handedly saving the world. Better yet, you're a legit outlaw this time around, not some drafted operative working for the federal government. There's no implicit association between your character and the, quote, good guys, unquote, that might make you feel like you should probably be behaving honorably or within the law. You aren't a hero. You can hold people up, burglarize homesteads, rob trains and stagecoaches, and so on, and so forth. Or you can be a good Samaritan and help random strangers with their problems wherever you roam. You know, whatever you want. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a near ultimate video game display of pure libertarianism. You do what you want, when you want, how you want. And that is, in fact, what the game's narrative is about, at least until a late-game twist happens that reframes the entire narrative. And like the games that I mentioned, Red Dead Redemption 2 is loaded with small mechanics and systems that also make your position on the map, where you're going, and how you plan to get there, all important and relevant. For one thing, there's a survival meter that constantly depletes if you're not regularly eating and sleeping. The time it takes to search dead bodies or to loot a burglarized home means you have to prioritize where to search and what to take if the authorities are closing in on you. Decaying animal carcasses force you to have to quickly turn them in for rewards or take them to camp to cook or craft with them. And cold weather will mean that you'd better pack a warm jacket before you travel into or through those mountains in the north. And then of course there's other games like Insomniacs' Marvel's Spider-Man. which has brought the joy of physics-based web swinging back to an open-world New York, and makes the simple act of traversing the map into a fun and surprisingly expressive pastime in and of itself. These games that I just talked about have all redefined what a big-budget open-world game can and should look like. They've set new standards for employing traversal mechanics that make the geography of the maps relevant and important, and they're taking the open-world sandbox paradigm seriously as a narrative device.
For the first time in weeks, nothing. We're free. We're free to plan our own futures once more. I hope so, Dutch.
Big budget games aren't the only games that are doing this. Indie games have been experimenting with the open world concept as well, and they've probably been doing it for even longer. If you turn off the current location indicator on the in-game map in Firewatch, then that game becomes a game about using nothing but a compass and a paper map to navigate in an environment by using physical signposts and landmarks, very similar to Shadow of the Colossus. 4 years prior to that, the game Miasmata actually attempted to gamify the process of cartography itself. You could only uncover areas of the map by triangulating your position in reference to 2 other known, visible landmarks. This is perhaps the only game that I've ever played in which I became hopelessly lost in the dead of night, to the point that I actually had to restart the entire game in order to do a better job of not straying too far out of the known map, and keeping myself oriented with regard to familiar landmarks. And I haven't even gotten around to playing the Outer Wilds or the Outer Worlds yet, because I'm patiently waiting for the Steam versions of those games, and, in the meantime, maybe I'll go back and play Fallout New Vegas while I wait. In any case, Outer Wilds apparently, as I've heard, employs a Majora's Mask style time loop. You are constantly working against a ticking clock, so every second that you spend exploring the open solar system is 1 second closer to having everything reset. Once again, where you go, how long it takes you to get there, and what you choose to do once you're there, as well as how long it takes to do it, are all vital to the game's gameplay and strategy. Now, just because I've only singled out 3 or 4 games does not mean that they are the only good open-world games that I've ever played, nor does it mean that every other open-world game is completely broken and poorly designed. In fact, every game exists on some kind of continuum of quality and design. Every open-world game probably does some things right and other things wrong. They experiment in some ways, and they play it safe in others. This is also true of the examples that I've cited as innovators, especially Final Fantasy XV. Grand Theft Autos 4 and 5 only allowed the player to fast travel by summoning a taxi and paying a fee, thus attaching a resource cost to avoid having to travel across the map yourself. You even have to pay an additional fee to skip the trip and to teleport. Fallout New Vegas' hardcore mode has an extensive set of survival meters that require you to have adequate resources before setting out on a lengthy trip to complete a quest, and your character is constantly being exposed to ambient radiation that limits where you can go and how long you can spend there. The Witcher 3 only allows you to fast travel between signposts, and its quests are designed to tell long, involved story vignettes that help to focus the player's attention for longer periods of time and to limit the amount of aimless wandering that you might try doing. Then there's games like Prototype, Infamous, and Sunset Overdrive, which also were early pioneers that experimented with different movement mechanics to make the travel across the map at least as engaging as the missions themselves, in much the same way that Spider-Man 2 and Insomniacs' Sony's Marvel's Spider-Man did with web swinging. But there is one game from last year that I think acts as a fantastic deep dive case study of how developers design traversal systems for open world games. And that game is going to be the subject of my next video. So if you enjoyed this video and can't wait to see the next one, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and click the little bell icon so that you'll be notified when it goes live in the next few weeks. You can also check out my Patreon page to gain access to exclusive previews of upcoming content and opportunities to vote on what future content you might want to see. My sincere thanks to my current patrons, whose support allows me to purchase the games that I use for research for these videos. Stay tuned, and in the meantime, happy gaming.